I'm here with Paul Dirks, and Paul, I'm really excited to talk to you. You have made some incredible videos, and I hope people will go watch them, where you have done sort of a meta-analysis on all the research relating to desistance and long-term outcomes of people who claim to be transgender. And they're really powerful because they show that the science doesn't support the claims of the transgender movement. And first of all, how did you get interested in this?
So firstly, thanks, Aaron. It's great to be with you. You are doing work. It's great. It's phenomenal. I mean, I can't possibly keep up, but it's a privilege to be with you. Um, yeah, I think that one of the things that really prompted me to get involved, probably first from sort of an advocacy side of things, before really jumping full force into the literature and trying to wrestle with what literature really was saying about these issues, was that I've got 5 children. My oldest is a girl, and this is now a number of years ago. But our local school district was bringing in new orders in regards to gender identity, and I realized that the implications for her was going to be that she was eventually going to be forced to change or shower or be in the same bathroom as males who identified as girls. Now, it's interesting how fast things have moved. That when the sort of the, if you want to use the word legislation or policy basis was being laid for these things, a lot of the actual practical side of things weren't happening yet. Like they are now. But I know that when Bill C-16 kind of came across my desk, and I don't know if you know the history of the bill, but it was fast tracked. No one really knew what was going on, at least as far as I could tell. And I realized that by that time I had done quite a bit of work in both sexual orientation and gender identity in the peer-reviewed literature, trying to make this understandable to people that here's the data, right? And so when Bill C-16 came across my desk, I realized that the implications for the entire country now, this wasn't going to be decided at the local school level with a school district, nor at even the provincial level so much, although that that was in play as well with our BC laws, but it was going to be the entire country, and it was going to be once for all. And so I felt like I needed to really dig in and dig into the literature side as well, even though my initial interest was really just in protecting women and their sex-based rights, their rights to consent and privacy. And I didn't feel like these things, I guess though, if I could just finish by saying this, that the one thing that really kept echoing in my mind is that if we lose freedoms for women, for children, that in 20, 40 years I'm going to be forced to to deal with the question from my daughter or granddaughters, where were you when all of our rights were being removed?
Right.
And I wanted to be able to say, hey, listen, even if I lost, I wanted to be able to say, listen, I did everything I could.
We were fighting the battle. And I
Yeah.
think that's how I feel about children who are being medicalized. I want them to know that there are people out here who were fighting for them. Even if they ended up getting pulled into that conveyor belt on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgeries, that there were people out there who were saying this isn't okay. Because if
Yeah.
there aren't, then it just means that we have a complacent society that's willing to allow women's rights to be eroded, that's willing to allow children to be medically experimented on. And to me, that's heartbreaking. I don't want to live in a culture where we just sort of sit back and allow that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know it's important, and I think that one of the deciding factors really is the courage to be able to deal with whatever the pushback may be, especially those that are in certain roles or have certain jobs. It gets into a very considerable sacrifice because of the current narrative, but I think the duty is there.
Well, and that's what's I've really struggled with, is that I have a lot of healthcare professionals who would like to speak to me, but they're afraid to.
Yeah.
And I'm just this person in northern Utah making these videos. It's not like I have a huge audience, and yet they're afraid to even talk to me. And so the fact that people are afraid to even step out of that kind of that bubble of protection that they get from politically correct speech, and say that children are being harmed and women are being harmed and boys are being harmed and men are being harmed. This is hurting everybody in our culture. But they're so afraid of the repercussions that they won't even speak out publicly to anybody. Is really scary.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And your research, I just want to we talked a little bit before we started, and I am shocked that you don't have hundreds of thousands of views on your videos, because they're so well done. You did such a good job of looking at the literature, explaining the literature, making connections between various studies, explaining the strengths and weaknesses of them. They're so powerful. And I just encourage people to go there and look at them. And you mentioned that you thought one of the reasons was because you're a Christian, and you're a pastor, if I'm not mistaken.
I am, yes.
And so often, it fills me with such, it's just so ironic to me now that Christians are the ones who are now using science. We're
Yeah.
the ones who are saying, wait a minute, we need to look at the science. And it's the other side that is almost got these religious overtones in
Yeah,
their
absolutely.
philosophy. Do
Yeah.
you have any sense of how that happened, that kind of that flip?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, uh, I think firstly, if and I think that there'd be secularists that would agree with me on this. Maybe not all, but some that the Christian worldview is actually that man is by nature a religious being, and so you can say that you don't have an overriding worldview or a religion, but you actually do. You have fundamental presuppositions, and we see that in I mean, it's been called, I don't usually use this language myself. I try to be very sensitive as I'm talking to these things. Obviously, you get labeled a bigot anyways, but I do try to be sensitive in my language. But when people talk about the trans cult, there's some real facts there upon which they're basing that, and the fact that there's all this language about kind of the acceptable kinds of ways to talk about things, being in the group, out of the group. Um, and yeah, so it's a challenge. Yeah, it's been an interesting flip. I've had actually some interesting email conversations. I don't want to get into details, but I've had some interesting email conversations with some of the authors of these studies. So just as one example of this, Aaron, and I'll keep things kind of general as far as all the details, but I was speaking with one of the researchers of a pretty important study, and it was fascinating that he felt like I had misrepresented some of his findings and data, and I was really quite surprised at that, because the way that some of what I had said was reported was, maybe I hadn't, said things quite right, but I had not misrepresented the data. I'm very careful of how I do that. And so I simply asked him some follow-up questions about the data. And it was interesting to see that he actually didn't want to talk about the data. He wanted to talk about ideological things and why it was that my views, he assumed what my views were and wanted to take things that way. So here is the pastor asking about the data, and here's the researcher wanting to talk about ideology, and even in this case, actually, he brought religion and his own religion into it,
Wow.
which is just fascinating.
That is,
So here's a beautiful, expression of this switch that you're talking about.
yeah, it's so fascinating. And one of the things that I think about is the most recent study that came out, Brandstrom and Pachinkas, I think it was, and the data showed that the long-term outcomes for people both on hormones as well as surgeries wasn't good. And yet the researcher kind of left out some data analysis so that he could present it as if these were positive findings for the trans movement. And so that is incredibly disturbing when you have researchers who are unwilling to represent their data accurately in order to push an ideology.
Yeah, and I think one of the greatest examples of this is actually Lindquist 2017. So Lindquist 2017, I mean, you know this, probably a lot of your viewers too do as well, but we actually don't have good methodological studies on the outcomes for, if you would compare our studies for, for medical transition to other fields, I mean, they're woefully inadequate. And so, people assume that, there's been lots of science done over 10, 20, 40 years. No, that's just not the case. So one example of that is that the best longitudinal study we have is a study by Lindquist in 2017 at 5 years longitudinal length. And they took a snapshot at I think just before transition, then just after, and then 3 years, 5 years. And it's fascinating that if you look at the data, you look at the tables, it is exceptionally clear that there is a very significant downward slide in the mental and social health aspects right across the board, even physical health, I believe, on all these different measures. And it's very clear if you compare, right after surgery to 5 years. And yet the authors disguise this truth, by the way that they use their language, and especially the title of the study. I to be honest, I'd have to bring it up. I forget exactly what the title is, but it's completely misrepresented as far as the title of it. I've mentioned before that I think the title should probably be "The Honeymoon Effects of Transition Don't Last." Like it's, and this is the best study we have, but because the authors themselves are, I believe, strongly mischaracterizing the data, and because there is so much bias even in reading it by others, it just doesn't get enough play.
Well, and the other thing is just the quality. As you said, there isn't a lot of good research. And the research that we have is often self-selected, self-reported individuals, retrospectives. There's very rarely controls. So the quality of the study just isn't good. Where, oftentimes we have advocacy groups or activist groups soliciting their members to come and take a study. And of course, we know how that's going to turn out. There were some studies that you talked about that actually had much better results in loss to follow-up, because a lot of the studies, they lose people along the way. And we call that loss to follow-up. So we don't really know what happened to them. And you can't really draw conclusions if you have lost a lot of people. But you had found some studies where it looked like maybe they had practitioners who were doing a better job of keeping in touch with people. And those didn't show good results at all for people transitioning.
Yeah, so in just to give your viewers a little bit of background, as far as there's most in most fields, once you hit about 20% loss to follow-up, you pretty much toss your results. Now, if you're engaged in a new field where there is no really good data, well, then you use the best data you got, and that's kind of the where we're at in a lot of this. But I mean, even people even look askance on 10% loss to follow up in many fields, right? And here in this field, in so many cases, you're dealing with 40, 50, or even 60% loss to follow up. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing that I've sometimes argued that, if I was a trans advocate, what is the best study that I would use? And frankly, it's a study that I believe came out of France, and good, as far as good sample size, and relatively long time. Not longitudinal, but relatively long time frame. But it's got like 45% loss to follow up. So and that's probably the best one you could point to if you're really trying to show that this is a successful means of treatment for gender dysphoria. But yeah, there's 3 studies that really have done an excellent job of kind of removing that barrier, the loss to follow up. 2 studies in 2011, one that's known very well, which is Desnay's out of Sweden. Asherman's, which I believe was out of Germany, also in 2011, and then one that's lesser well known but should be better known, because it's the best methodological study we probably have, even though it's a smaller sample size. And that's Simon's in 2016, which is Denmark, I believe. And when you look at these, and so the thing that's unique about these is these European countries For better or for worse, you're an American, so you hold your liberties particularly strong, and here in Canada we would maybe not quite as much, but more so than the Europeans. But again, for better or for worse, the Europeans track a lot of data, and so they are able to look in rather than necessarily doing the hard work, and it's costly. It's to try to follow up everybody, which back in the 70s and even early 80s they did that with some of the studies. People throw out old studies, but in some cases some of the older studies actually are better methodologically. And so you need to be careful not to just throw them out. But more recently, if you've got a sample size of 100 people, it's very rare if you have significant loss to follow up that they go chasing everybody, if that's even possible. But in these European countries, they've got registry data that they can go and pull from, and quite effectively do studies that presumably don't have nearly the same cost to them. And so these studies all in Europe can pull from that registry data, and they have either no loss to follow up at all in the case of Dejne or Asherman. In the case of Simonson, I think there's one sort of loss to follow up. So, but you're talking about 98% being able to follow up with people. And yeah, the results are, if you just take that sample of those 3 registry studies and you compare their results to these other studies where they're having 40, 50%, 60% loss to follow up, it's marked the difference in just how negative the results are for medical transition.
Well, Dejne, it's scary. I believe, isn't that the one that shows an incredibly high rate of suicide after about 10 years for people who've undergone gender surgery?
Yeah, it does. And part of the challenge, of course, is that Dejne doesn't read her study that way. And there are others. If you read the literature, I've done a little bit of poking around, and you want to, if you take a look at how other authors interpret Dejne's data, there's quite a variance. There's some that side with Dejne, and I'll tell you her view in a minute. But there are lots of others, good, reputable people that say, no, this clearly shows, that there's significant problems. 5-10 years in, there's a significant drop off in mental health. So Dejne's own view is that what you're not getting is a time effect on the individuals per se, because it's not a longitudinal study. What you're getting is the effects of the efficacy of current treatment. So that she believes that if you did the same study in another 10 years, that you wouldn't see the same drop off. That because treatments are better, and perhaps even because society is more accepting, that the outcomes will be better. So it's you look at the data, and I think the data is pretty clear, and especially as you compare it to other longitudinal studies. And again, we don't have a lot, but we've got things like Lindquist. There's a few others as well, and you start to say, hang on, there's a pattern here, right? That there is a significant drop off in the health benefits of this kind of treatment.
Well, and it's
but
interesting.
it does give room for the other side to go, oh no,
Right. But my interpretation of Dejne's claim is that we are now medically transitioning children who, with all the data from the studies about desistance, would likely have desisted. And to me, my hunch is that we're going to have far worse outcomes, because we are starting to, we've seen studies that show that if you socially transition someone, they're far more likely to medically transition. And we're medically transitioning children at incredibly early ages, sometimes as young as 8 years old. Kids are getting on cross-sex hormones. Kids as young as 12 and 13 are having their breasts amputated. Kids as young as 15 are having their testicles removed. And so to me, my concern would be that Dejne didn't look at these. Her study subjects were primarily older adults who wanted to transition and who had had time to process it and look through other treatments, and that this was the route that they wanted. Now we have kids, and we have absolutely no longitudinal studies on what happens to these kids, not to mention the health benefits, which we do know about, or risks. We do know that the health risks are tremendous. And so, you know, as someone, I actually have some chronic medical conditions, and they can be really debilitating, both physically and mentally. And we're diseasing children now at an early age. And to me, that alone is going to have incredible mental health impacts.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's unfortunate that we can't follow the data, and to be honest, I think that most people would even say that these things are common sense. So there's that as well. But you know, in all reality, the way the trajectory is, I think things only probably change with lawsuits.
Mm.
And of course, you know, there's the possibility that something could even change as early as next week with the Kiribel um, situation case in the UK.
Well,
But
and
you
in
know,
Canada, aren't they now considering, because this is another factor, the conversion therapy regulations that are being
yes,
passed internationally. I believe Canada has having hearings now, and for people who don't know what these will do, is they actually prevent therapists from helping identify underlying causes of gender identity issues.
yeah, absolutely. No, it's very frightening what's happening with Bill C6 right now in Canada, and I've been engaged with a number of people that have either put in briefs or are trying to organize, you know, people to speak to the you know, to the Justice Committee. Currently, it is very likely that these hearings will happen very soon. The testimony to the committees. Um, but yeah, it's remarkable just how far away from both the data and I think the public opinion um, this overreaching law is. And you're exactly right that really the only thing that is left on the table is affirmation, but it also prevents, you know, people from, you know, from detransitioning. And so that's, I mean, it's really is horrific. And I think that we'll end up looking back on these things the way we've looked back on some of the most horrible medical scandals, perhaps even in history, but at least certainly in the last 100 years. Because the data was all there. It was all there. It was all there all along. And it's just that you sidelined people that, you know, that could tell you the truth, you know, because of ideological and social political reasons.
Well, and to me, that's the most disturbing about all this, is that um, common sense, as you mentioned, suggests that you shouldn't medicalize somebody for a mental health issue. And it's becoming increasingly clear that, and again, common sense, that people develop these gender identity issues as a result of struggles, sometimes with autism, sometimes with sexual assault, sometimes with bullying. And we are actually now denying these children access to mental health services to help them process that, and instead putting them on this pathway which results in disease and long-term medicalization.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that you can tell if a policy is bad, and sometimes sadly only after the fact, and frankly, as somebody who's more on the conservative side of things, I feel this way actually about a lot of sort of leftist policies, which is that they end up hurting the very people they purport to help. And you know, I think that it is the vulnerable, it's the particularly vulnerable in some cases who are you know, do not adhere to strict gender norms. You know, in some ways that's the very people they want to help, but it's going to be the exact people that end up suffering the most with bad legislation. It's so sad that you know, you can't, I mean, you know, often what's said to me is, you know, why are you so against this particular group? And it's sad because I feel actually I'm trying to protect this group, you know.
Yeah,
I care about this group, um,
and
and
it's
this is going
funny.
to harm this group.
Yeah, I actually had a sign made up that said "Stop Trans Eugenics" and wore it to a local pro-trans rally, because to me, we are seeing a eugenics movement against children who have gender identity issues, that as a society, we've decided that it's okay to sterilize these kids. And I can't think of anything more horrendous than this wholesale embracing of sterilizing children.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that you would think that those on the left side of things, at least this is the way it breaks down. I think it breaks down the same way in the United States. But yeah, I wish they would realize is that same-sex attracted individuals are far more likely to. In my research, I did a deep dive at one point. It's about 50%. Now, the interesting thing that I haven't yet figured out is that it's sometimes purported to be even higher than that. But at one point I went through all of the studies on desistance and tabulated the totals personally by hand, and it came out actually at exactly 50% of those who desisted, had same-sex attraction. And so, the people it's going to be harming. I mean, to put it this way, by having a conversion therapy ban, you are ensuring conversion therapy happens.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and and I care about those who are same-sex attracted. I may have significant social policy differences with with many LGBT people, but we can agree that this is atrocious for those who have same-sex attractions, that we're putting in a policy that sterilizes them and medicalizes them, and and in some cases amputates them. I mean, it's atrocious.
So speaking of that, and that's something I don't know if you have a good sense of this, but Abigail Schreier has done a fabulous job of looking at ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria in girls, and really shed some light on some of these underlying issues, one of which is the same-sex attraction. And she identified a whole lot of other kind of factors that contribute to gender identity issues in girls. I'm hearing from mothers and fathers of boys who are saying, wait a minute, can we have somebody look into this for boys? Because especially on the left, it seems like a lot of people are saying, see, and this is where it gets dicey because of identity politics, trying to identify the specific segment, but especially I think among radical feminists who are saying that boys and men who identify as transgender are actually autogynephilic, and it's a sexual perversion, it's a sexual fetish. And yet I'm not getting that from these mothers. These are mothers of young children who should not be exhibiting autogynephilia, who are really too young to be having that kind of sexual proclivity yet, and it's like we are very compassionate to the girls who develop ROGD, but we aren't even looking at what's happening with boys. And I was wondering if in your research, if you had identified, even in earlier research, where kind of risk factors or causes for men to develop gender identity issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I'm not sure if I have much to add to what you have said. There's no question that there's a significant autogynephilic, portion of male to females, and you see that very clearly in the literature, as long as you're open to considering it. Of course, there's many people that aren't, but Ray Blanchard's work is it's very strong methodologically. I think that one of the things that we need to look at, if I can kind of take this just a little bit of a different direction, I think one of the things we need to look at, and some of your viewers may reject this perspective, but I think one of the things we need to consider is what is it that would make somebody happy with being who they are as far as their gender. And so, I am not surprised that many young women, and there's a host of issues, don't get me wrong, but I'm not surprised that these other, perhaps more explicit issues or more narrow issues take place within a larger context in which we don't communicate to girls why it's good to be a girl. And we don't do the same with men as well. That we don't raise our boys saying, hey, listen, this is what it means to be a man. this is what is, this is where the strengths of men are. This is how you should use those strengths, not just for yourself, but for others. And we don't communicate that to girls either. And so it's really not surprising that when you add in some of these other things like porn and how masculinity is used in a detrimental way. I mean, there's all sorts of societal pressures and transgender contagion, peer contagion, and these different aspects. It really isn't surprising. There's a lot of girls that put up their hands and say, "Hey, I'm not interested in being a girl," and now it looks like I don't have to be, right? Instead, from a more basic societal standpoint, what's good about being a girl? Have we communicated that to girls? What's good about being a boy? Have we communicated that to boys? Because I really do believe that men and women are different. And that difference is good. It's good for society as well as, I think you see it most clearly in marriages, but it's good for society in general. These differences. It's ironic to me that we live in a world that uses the word diversity a lot. But at the same time, it seems to me that we have undermined the most fundamental diversity that exists, which is male and female. And, we'll have every other kind of diversity, but we can't have any diversity, and, male and female can't be fundamentally different in any way. So yeah, I think that we need to do some work at kind of a more fundamental level.
That's an interesting thought, because as I'm looking back to the Metoo movement, which just really like swept the sort of internationally, and the narrative that came out of that is that women and girls are victims and men and boys are victimizers. And it really, I think if especially for the generation that was just old enough to sort of pick up on that, which is kind of what we're seeing, who are hitting their teen years now, that they kind of got inundated with this message that girls are victims and boys are victimizers. And so, it makes sense for both perspectives. If you're a girl who thinks you're going to be a victim, of course you're going to want to, somehow change that. And if you're a boy who's being told that you're the oppressor, you're the victimizer, and there's, you're in the wrong all the time, it's not surprising that some of those boys would be like, well, I'll just be a girl, and that way I don't have to be labeled as the victimizer. And I don't know if there's a correlation there or not, but I do, when I look at the timing of it, that happened, about 5 years ago? And now those kids are growing up, and we're just seeing this explosion of kids who are having gender identity issues.
Yeah. So my views of the Me Too movement are perhaps not quite as negative as yours. I do believe there is some significant good that came out of that, in the sense of just the global recognition of the amount of sexual abuse that goes on, especially in marketplaces. One thing that I think was really helpful with the Me Too movement is that in some cases, a lot of the same people that would actually visibly advocate for women's rights were actually, perpetrating sexual abuse, kind of behind the scenes. And I think that's helpful to point out inconsistencies in people. Personally, I think there's far more of those inconsistencies on the left than on the right. Even though there is sexual abuse on both sides. And for instance, I don't shy away in my advocacy from talking about the sexual abuse that happens even in the church. That's an important thing to bring out into the light. But I do think that there's certainly a trajectory towards this victimization culture, intersectionalism, where the person. I mean, it's never going to go well in society if the person with the most victimization wins, right? That's not helpful for society, and frankly, that's not that helpful for an individual either, to consider their fundamental identity as being downtrodden. And this is one of the places where I don't necessarily, this isn't part of my advocacy, but where I would kind of push back a little bit against some of the feminists and radical feminists that I guess it'd be more radical feminists that would almost seem to define womanhood in regards to their victimhood. And it's not that I don't agree that women have suffered tremendous abuses at the hands of men. I'll characterize that very differently than they will, and there's some very fundamental differences that I'll have in regards to the patriarchy, masculinity, femininity. So, but
but I think at this point, I just want to mention that there's a fundamental problem to that, which is that that's a negative message. It's an inherently negative message to tell women that, what's the good thing about being a woman? Well, it's that we fight against our oppression. That's actually a negative, right? Okay, so what happens if you win? Is there anything good about being a woman?
We're
We
no
need to.
longer, yeah, just, yeah. And that's something that I actually have really chafed against, because I've been a lifelong liberal. And yet at some point when when I started having kids, I started having this sense of like, it wasn't really okay for me to be excited about being mother, that my
Right.
career was supposed to come first. And actually something pretty traumatic happened that really shook me up. And I had my daughter, I went back to work after 2 weeks after I had her,
Mm.
put her in a daycare. And it turns out that the woman who it was a home daycare, she killed a baby while my daughter was there. And there was this huge investigation, and an officer, I had to testify. The officer, it was in the news, it was a big deal. And the officer said, if we were lucky that my daughter was only neglected, because apparently this woman took the baby, stripped him down, and stuck him in a closet in the basement. I mean, this is the stuff of horror. And what it did was it shook me enough to say, whoa, that baby is now the most important thing in my life. My daughter is now number one. And I quit my job and I became a stay-at-home mom, and I worked some odd jobs to augment our salary, our income. But suddenly I went from being feminist, career-oriented woman to being a full-time mom and
Mm.
loving it. And it upsets me that another woman lost her baby for me to realize how important it was to be a mom. But then when I came back into the kind of the world, I noticed that there is this big rift between women who choose careers over women who choose to be moms. And there really is almost like a negative stereotype if you're a stay-at-home mom, that either you're not capable of getting a job, or you're lazy, that we aren't rejoicing in motherhood, which is the
Right.
one thing that women do that men can't
Yes.
do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's, I mean, here's the truth is that you ask a woman what the most significant thing about their life is, and they'll probably say, at least at the top, or maybe second on their list, is going to be having children. Like, my children are and yet we live in a society where we can't tell girls that, right? Like, we can't tell girls that, hey, listen, one of the best things that could possibly happen to you is that you're gonna be a mother. And even in Canada, I mean, there's been a steep drop off in the percentage of women that will end up being mothers in their life. But even still, even now, with that significant drop off, I think it's about 85%. So it's still a very, very high number of women that will have a child in the course of their life. And it will be, for those women, in almost all cases, the most significant and best part of their lives. Like, we should be preparing girls, especially and connecting back to gender dysphoria, connecting back to the very challenging times of puberty, the onset of it, and the growth of your body, and all of the challenges of the hormones and everything going along with that, as well as the onset of attractions. I mean, it's a very tumultuous time. And we need to be able to have a positive message in that time to say, this would have happened throughout all of history, where you would say, hey, listen, you are being prepared for motherhood, to the woman or to the man, this is what your role is going to be. And even now, statistically, that's still going to be the case in a lot of situations. So
That's interesting the way you put that, because I'm thinking if I was going through all these changes, puberty, as you mentioned, it's not fun. And if I thought I was going through them just because I was a woman, but that there wasn't an end goal, that there wasn't really a good reason for it, I would be like, yeah, give me some testosterone. I don't want to menstruate. I don't want, all these changes happening to my body. And I do think that we need to, if we say that men and women are the same, then there really isn't a reason why we shouldn't have girls on testosterone and boys on estrogen. That it is these fundamental differences in our ability to reproduce that define us as male and female.
yeah, it is. And the interesting part that I think people need to wrestle with who kind of chafe against some of where I guess I would be as far as the implications of that for families and society, is that some of these biological things are intrinsically related to the larger social and things. So for instance, there's research that's come out, I think it's quite recent, or at least it's been kind of solidified more recently, that in childbirth there's onset of hormones that affect the brain, that actually bring about a mothering instinct in women, and it happens biologically. So when you start to say things like, if you chafe against the fact that women maybe have are more inclined to take care of their children, there's actually a biological basis for that in childbirth. And these things work together. I mean, here's an example when it comes to men, because of course I'm interested in men also understanding their roles, and there's no question biologically males are stronger than women. I mean, it's really clear. At one point I had somebody. I try to be patient with people when I don't engage all the time. Sometimes I use Twitter just to throw out ideas. I used to do it a lot of engagement. It just takes a tremendous amount of time. But every once in a while, you go down one of these paths with somebody because you think, well, if I'm just patient, I give them the facts, maybe I'll be able to convince them. And sometimes you do, or sometimes you do later, it makes an impact. But I remember talking at one point with somebody, I think actually in my local community, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know him, but I think, maybe a friend of a friend that actually has a trans child. And as we were talking through some of this, and he actually argued, apparently he had some connection with rugby, and he actually argued that women are not less strong than men when it comes to rugby. And I'm like, how do you, like, what? That's just insane. There's actually a video out there of a woman actually taking probably about an 80% hit from a football player just to kind of feel what it's like. And it's actually frightening. Like you watch it and you think, okay, don't ever do that again. Like you're gonna, and you get the sense it wasn't 100% hit, but like you are going to destroy that woman.
Yeah.
There are physiological differences, and we all know this. I mean, it certainly, but then the question is though, okay, so if the biological fact is that 90% of men are stronger than 90% of women, what do you do with that? Does that have implications for society? And I think the answer is yes. I think that for me, every once in a while here in Vancouver, it snows. We're not kind of, people think of Canada as, snow all the time. It's not the case in Vancouver. But when it snows here in Vancouver, because it's wet and stuff, everything gets slippery and wet. And when it comes to walking down these slippery sidewalks, I move off the sidewalk for any woman that comes by. And now, why do I do that? Well, at a fundamental level, the reason I move off the sidewalk for a woman is precisely because I don't have to. The fact is that if I chose not to move, that woman would have to move almost all the time. I'm not a particularly strong man, but I'm stronger than 95% of the women out there by virtue of being, a male in relatively decent shape. And if I wanted to have the right to that space by virtue of strength and domineering, I could. And so how do you use strength? Well, I think we need to teach men, and you can call this a throwback to an ancient civilization if you want. I think it's just implications of biology, that you use it to serve others. And the reason you move is because you don't have to, that you use your strength to serve others. And I think that's what we need to teach our boys.
It's really interesting because I think, again, you mentioned earlier that sometimes the policies of the left hurt the very people they're designed to help. And I think that this is really a good example in the case of women's rights, especially now, that there are all these policies now that are going into effect that suggest that a man who claims to believe he feels like a woman is actually a woman and is going to be entitled to the same spaces and the same protections and the same rights as women. And to me, what that does is it privileges men's feelings over women's basic rights and protections, which is really a scary thing when you start taking that away. Because as you said, in a locker room, if I'm in a locker room with 90% of men, they're going to be bigger and stronger than me. Not to mention, the other physical differences, but just the fact that I am going to be inherently more vulnerable. And that's not a victim mentality. This is sort of more about, physicalness, that I don't, I'm not necessarily a victim, but I'm definitely not on the, they're going to be able to overpower me if they want to. And so that's one of the reasons we have separate spaces, is because we recognize these physical differences. And it's like, we've all taken this pill and decided that there aren't differences anymore. And it's had ramifications just throughout society. And it makes me so sad, because when I was a kid, I remember there was a movement towards like job sharing, so that women could work part-time but that be at home part-time, and dads could work part-time and be at home part-time, and that children were important. And it seems like the lowdown of all of this is that children are no longer important, that we don't take the time to care for them, that being a mother and a father is no longer an important job, and that we can just pay people to do that.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think one of the things that sometimes gets lost in light of the debate on women's rights to, to sex-based privacy is the whole issue of consent. That, I do think there's an important argument when it comes to protections. And you may be aware of my Target study that I've put together.
No, is that Target the store?
Yeah. So probably one of the more significant things I've done is produced a study. It's independent, so it's just myself, but taking a look at all of the media reported sexual violence against women, and compared the time prior to Target's policy announcement that they were going to be having sex-based that they would no longer be having sex-based spaces, and then comparing it afterwards, and taking a look at weighing in the media reports whether there was more, for instance, voyeurism or other sexual assaults in those spaces. And what it shows is that when it comes to these to particular things like peeping tom voyeurism or exposure, that there was roughly about a threefold increase.
Wow.
After the policy went into effect. It's a study that has some weaknesses, in the sense that it'd be useful to put that side by side with police reports and to see if there's any difference between the media reports and the police reports, and so but it probably remains one of the best pieces of data that out there currently on the question of whether women are harmed by not having sex-based spaces. So yeah, that's available at my site, womanmeanssomething.com.
And I'll
I know that when I first put it,
description, I'll post the link to that, because I think that that's really important. Because as you're talking about Target, I'm thinking, if anybody gets to decide which bathroom they go on based on their feelings, at some point we don't need sex segregated bathrooms, and we're back to where we were before women got the right to having their spaces separated from men's, and it just is so regressive. It's confusing to me.
Yeah, and somehow we're not smart enough to figure that out, right? Like, I mean, it's one of those things where you get so smart that you become just ridiculously stupid. But
So as we're finishing up here, is there, like, where do you see this kind of going? Because especially Canada, it seems like it's just like great guns going forward with this. They're allowing children to gain access to cross-sex hormones without parental consent or knowledge, potentially even getting surgeries, and now the conversion therapy ban. How do you see us getting through this? Is it just us kind of grassroots activists standing up and saying, wait, we need to stop this? Or do you see sort of lawsuits being what end up changing the tide, or just information? Because you mentioned, I keep thinking if most people knew what's going on, they wouldn't stand for it, but they don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So, starting with the positive, I've been working on this kind of stuff now for maybe about 4 years. And I tell you, there were not many people working on these kinds of things 4 years ago. at least, here in Canada. I mean, and some of the people that were, I've come to know and respect because we've fought side by side, and sometimes in very different ways, and sometimes even with very different political views. Here in Canada, Megan Murphy was one of the first. I remember reading some of her early articles, and there was hardly anybody else speaking about it. And then it wasn't long after that Jordan Peterson joined the fray. But but at the level of sort of people that are willing to take a stand on some of these issues, we've come a long way in Forge, a long way. So, for instance, I was targeted very, very strongly in the early going. So strong was the resistance that it was like anybody that kind of put up their head above the fray, they were going to get nailed. And I had to take that in the early going with some of my early work in advocacy. But now there's no way that the trans advocates can keep up with everybody that's putting their head up above the fray. Now, that's not to say that there aren't sometimes implications. For instance, especially in some fields, you have certain jobs. If you were to make your views known on this, but just as an example, coming from a church background, I mean, they target. There's a protest outside our church because of my work. It wasn't a church advocacy. It was personal advocacy, but they protested outside my church. Some of these advocates. I think in general that went well, but now and in that early going there was sort of protests that were they'd say, well, the protest is going to come to your church if you do this, and now there's no way that happens. We do all sorts of events all over the place now, and don't have protests because they can't possibly keep up. There's people now speaking out, and I know that's the case amongst the radical feminists and among other groups as well. So there's positive things going on. The amount of people doing the kinds of things that you're doing, like they didn't exist. I've thought actually for many, many years, I've thought of doing the kinds of things that you're doing now. You're doing it far better than I would have, but or Benjamin Joyce, some of the things he's doing, right? But so there's lots of stuff going on that wasn't happening 4 years ago. The challenge is that we have a lack of courage at the level of the political sphere. No one wants to touch this stuff politically. Up here in Canada, I'm so thankful that there are a few people now starting to speak out, and I'm so thankful for that. So, but as far as where things are actually going to go, I think it's going to be courts. I think it's going to be courts that eventually turn things. Short of a mass movement of people, protesting and a turn of kind of. At some point, there's a flip where in society, okay, now we think everybody feels this way, so now I'm going to feel this way. That could happen, but I think it's probably more likely that there'll be something, or in conjunction with that it'll be something that happens in the court system.
Well, and one of the things that I should have probably brought this up sooner because it's kind of a big question, but there is sort of this sense that the left is tolerant and loving and kind, and that those of us who are challenging this are haters and bigots and Nazis. And I just wondered if you could address that, because I know that those that I work with and those that I interview and those that I correspond with are speaking out because of love, because of concern, because of compassion. We are not like the Westboro Baptists who went to gays' funerals and said that they were going to hell. And I think that sometimes it gets conflated and people think, oh, you're just one of those crazy conservatives. You're just one of those crazy Christians. You're just intolerant. And I was wondering if you could just address that, because I think it's really important that we make it clear that we are not homophobic, that we are not transphobic, that we do not hate these people, that we do not feel the right to judge them.
Yeah. So I think I think connecting back to something I said earlier, that I have significant concern about the fact, for instance, this is one example of the many same-sex attracted adolescents that are being pulled into being sterilized and medicalized and having their breasts removed, et cetera, and there's significant work to be done across the aisle in saying, hey, this is horrific. I work actually in some cases a little bit somewhat closely with lesbians that are opposing this kind of thing. In some cases, maybe it's just a little bit further afield, but there's this trading of information. And so like there's a lot of ways in which we're on the same side trying to protect individuals. From my view, people that are made in the image of God, you know, and so there's tremendous concern for everyone, whether they are, you know, gender dysphoric, whether they're same-sex attracted. Um, you know, there's we care about people. That's the bottom line. And you know, I think I've heard, so there, you know, I've a lesbian friend here in the local area, and you know, one of the things she said to me is, you know, after this is done, we can argue about the other stuff, but first we've got to save some lives. And I mean, I think that that's exactly right. And it's not that I wouldn't get into. It's not as if none of the other stuff is important to me, or that we wouldn't have significant differences on some social or policy issues, or identity politics, or some of these things. But there's a fundamental concern for people here that that the current legislation, the way society is going, is harming the same people it wants to help.
Right. And I think that that's something that you mention on your videos, is that you are coming out of this in a position of love, and especially with children. When you find out that children are being harmed, it's hard for me to imagine how people can sit back and accept it. And it's because of this flipping that we've done of reality, where people believe that they're helping children by medicalizing them. They're helping children by telling them that they're inherently flawed. They're helping children by telling them that, you know, whatever that underlying cause is that's caused them to have these feelings, that we're going to just bury that and not allow therapists to try and uncover it and help alleviate these feelings of dysphoria. And so I think that that's a message that's really important to get out there, that this is coming from a place of compassion and love. And you know, we're not haters. we're not out here telling people they're going to hell. We're saying, you know, we've got good data that shows that these medical interventions are dangerous and damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I 100% agree, and try to reinforce that. I do actually a lot of training locally, training events. In some cases, they're deep dives into the literature. In other cases, they're a little bit more kind of general, and take in some more political aspects, and both in faith and non-faith settings. But yeah, we always start by saying, hey, listen, if you're somebody that's coming here out of a position of hate, you know, we don't want you here. And there's the doors, because we want this to be a place, in fact, where somebody from you know, somebody who is gender dysphoric, somebody who is same-sex attracted, could be here, and they're not going to feel attacked. They, you know, maybe their position will feel a little attacked, but you know, their position might be criticized, but we want this to be a safe place for everybody in the sense of their person, and their value and their honor as a person. And so no, that's highly important.
Well, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about before we end?
Well, you know, there are other areas that we could talk about, and but I think that that you're doing such a great job of I know many of these other things come out in other interviews with so many other people that you're talking to, and I just commend you for what you're doing, Aaron, and keep it up.
Well, and I just want to encourage anybody who's watching this to go to your original videos, because they are just incredibly compelling. I don't know how anybody could watch those and not at least think, huh, maybe I need to look into this a little bit more, because again, the data is so clear, and we have our sort of common sense response of, you know, it's probably not a good idea to medicalize kids who are likely to desist if they go through puberty. But then when you see the data, it's just so compelling, and the better studies, as you mentioned, are even more concerning about how this is impacting our kids and our adults. I mean, this is something that's sort of affecting us societally as a whole. So thank you so much for your work.